Oh, see, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, oh, the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket trembling, the bombs musketating, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, traitors and star-spangled banner gave way for the land unafraid. In the
Welcome to the God, Family, and Country radio show. This show is dedicated to a revival in this great nation. This show is a call for all Christians to live as God has commanded. 2 Chronicles 7:14 states, "And my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways. Then I will hear from heaven, will forgive their sins, and heal their land." This is a call for the recommitment to your family to pray together and live a Christian life. This is a call to action in defense of our country, our Constitution, the amendments, and Bill of Rights, which were given to us from God. This show is dedicated to sharing a message of how God, family, and country apply to you. And now, here's the host of the God, Family, and Country.
Good evening, San Antonio. Welcome to the God Family Country Show with Lance Hoppus, and I am not Lance Hoppus. We're glad to have you on board tonight. Lance is doing some work and is unavailable to be here tonight, but he asked me to take over. My name is Roy White. I'm with the Truth in Texas Textbooks, formerly known as that. We're now known as Truth in Textbooks. We're also with the G416 Patriots group here in San Antonio. And this past week we had a great guest, Dr. David Wood, who's our special guest tonight. He was on last week. If you enjoyed what you heard last week, you're going to enjoy the next 2 hours, because we're going to be talking about our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, and we're also going to be talking about the challenges that we face here in America, about the challenges of the spiritual battle that's going on between Islam and Christianity. And Dr. David Wood is an expert in this area. You're listening to the KLUP here on The Answer. We want you to dial in, tell your friends, if they're not on right now, they need to come on and listen to the show tonight. We're on from 8 to 10 o'clock for the next 2 hours, and we're also going to be on later tonight on AM 640 The Word at KSLR from 11 to 1 AM for those night riders who are out there. So if you've got the next shift, let your friends know, hey, if they missed it now, it'll also be on the podcast, which will be at GodFamilyCountryShow.com, where you'll see Lance's handsome face. You won't see mine. I've got more of a face for radio. So we're going to have Lance putting this podcast up, as he does every week, on www.GodFamilyCountryShow.com, and you can find it also at AM 930. The Answer, just search for God Family Country Show, and they'll take you to the SoundCloud podcast site. But welcome to all of you who are listening maybe for the first time, or for our regular listeners, welcome back. We've got with us in the studio today Dr. David Wood from New York, who's a doctorate of philosophy from Fordham University, but David's story is truly unique, and we're going to spend the first segment talking about his testimony and how he came to the Lord and the path he took. And to say he took a path that's different than most people doesn't really adequately describe what path he's gone on, but we're going to hear that from him. And in the second hour, we're going to talk a little bit more about what Christians need to understand about Islam. What are the key elements about Islam for us to understand, not to fear Islam, but to understand when we're speaking with our Muslim friends or interacting with Muslims, what is going on with their faith and their ideology that makes it such, for a lot of people, difficult to understand. But we're going to unpack that in the second hour, so please stick around for that, and we're just happy to have you on board with us tonight for what I think is one of the most learned persons I know in the world of Christian apologists. And we saw that this past week with a great turnout here in San Antonio. And if you want to get on our newsletter to find out what other speakers we're having, then come and write to us at g416patriots@gmail.com. And you think, G416, what the heck is that? Is that a fighter airplane? Well, I used to be a fighter pilot. That's true. But G416 stands for Galatians 4:16. And Galatians 4:16, the verse is from Paul saying to the Galatians, am I now your enemy for telling you the truth? And that is the conflict that so many people who have in this world today, who are speaking the truth, just as Paul did to the Galatians, that anyone can become a Christian. Because the Galatians were under the impression, the Jews who were there, that Jesus was a Jew. You can't really be a Christian unless you were a Jew. And he was trying to explain to them the second time around, because he had been there before and had told them, hey, anyone, Gentile, pagans, anyone has the power to become a Christian and to enter the kingdom of heaven if you accept that Jesus Christ is our Savior, that it's the Son of God, that he died on the cross, rose again, and is here, and you have to accept him into your heart. You do that. It does not matter if you're a Jew, Christian, pagan. You do those things. You don't have to go through any rituals. You don't have to do anything fancy. You just have to accept him into your heart. And he told them that the first time, and they accepted it. But when he came back the second time, they were very resistant to that message and began to criticize him and began to, change their view of this man that they believed held the truth, and he was saying exactly the same thing. And we're going to be sharing with you tonight the truth about Islam, and that is what is going to change our world. If we would have pastors who would speak the truth, like we have Pastor Steve Brantz and Pastor Charles Flowers and many others here in the local community, we need more pastors speaking the truth about Islam. We wouldn't have to send 15,000, 150,000 troops to the Middle East. We could be solving this because we have the truth, we have the Holy Spirit and Jesus Christ on our side to be able to do that. And Dr. Wood, David, I want to welcome you to the Lance Hoppe Show. I'm sorry Lance couldn't be here. He enjoyed his time last week, but welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Good to be here, Roy.
Well, I appreciate it. We were going to unpack a little bit about your history. As you started off, you started off in a household in West Virginia that, as you described, was not your typical all-American family. Would that be a fair assessment?
Oh yeah, I grew up in a trailer park in a little place called Granville, West Virginia. I think there's a population of a couple hundred, and the town is basically one big trailer park and a couple of houses, and the railroad track right behind the place. And my mom had never even graduated high school. She worked as a bartender, so she would be gone at nights, and then would sleep during the day. So I was on my own quite a bit growing up, and
so Christianity was it was really any elements at all. Christianity crept into your life. Right?
No, the only time that anything would happen where I would go to church is if I stayed over at my grandmother's house for some reason. So if I visited my grandmother or my cousin Brandy, her mom would make us go to church, and it was pretty much the worst experience of the week if grandma or my Aunt Karen made me go to church. They would take me to this church, and I would sit beside the clock, and I would stare at the clock the entire time until it was over, and then I would run downstairs, and there would be brownies there. So that was it was good to get it over with.
Well, in your testimony, and David has a website and he also has a ministry, a nonprofit called Acts 17 Apologetics Ministry. And you can find him by going to YouTube, Google up Dr. David Wood, Acts 17 Apologetics. You'll find his website. And there are over 600 YouTube videos that he's made. Last count, and that number is probably not even accurate now, but 42 million views of the YouTube videos he has made. And since that journey of leaving West Virginia and beginning your path, you started off as a young man, to say the least, a little troubled.
Yeah, and you know, apart from even me, you know, because I learned this from experience, that if you're growing up and you see the world in a different way because you actually have some psychological problems, you don't know that until you actually get diagnosed with something and they tell you, oh, we know what the problem is here, and
Right.
This is what the problem is. You have this psychological problem. Until they tell you that, you're growing up and you don't know that you have a problem, right? You think that's the way the world is.
Right.
So I found out I guess I was 5 years old, and I'd had a dog as long as I can remember, dog named Goliath, and one day my mom gets a phone call, and she turns to me with tears in her eyes and says that my dog Goliath had just been run over by a bus. And I thought to myself, so what? It's just a dog, right? And then I'm looking at my mom, and she's got tears in her eyes. I'm like, what's wrong with her? Did she think this dog was going to live forever or something? And so I thought there was something wrong with my mom for crying
Right.
over a dog that she hated. She hated my dog, and she's still crying over it. And that was the dog I hung out with all day long, and he dies, and I didn't care at all. But I thought there was something weird about my mom. And over time, I find out that other people, so I had friends who
Right.
had a dog, also got hit by a car, and they're all crying all evening. It's like, this is like common that these people have this.
Emotional response to something that to you made no sense at all.
Yeah, so then I realized that other people are like this, and of course, this wasn't until years later that I find out that there are people who are like me, that this is an actual diagnosis. But I growing up, I just thought everyone else is kind of stupid or irrational, right? Were you so emotionally attached that you thought this thing was going to live forever, and now you're all broken up and you can't figure out how the world works, something like that. But eventually, my one of my best friends growing up, Jimmy Lindholm, died parasailing. I was 16 years old.
Right.
And he talked for years. He talked about wanting to go parasailing, and he finally did it. His harness broke, and he plummeted to his death. And I was told about this, but I had the same reaction, which was no reaction. I had the same response that I'd had to my dog, namely, he was going to die anyway.
Right.
And but there it was a little bit different, because I started walking away going, well, it actually made sense when it was just a dog for me to think, well, it's just a dog. But here's one of my best friends that I'll never see again. It seems like I should be affected somehow. This should be bothering me somehow, and it doesn't bother me at all. So at that point, I started thinking, do I have some sort of problem?
Right.
So I had to wrestle with that for a while and try to figure it out. But instead of concluding that I had a problem, I concluded that I had evolved to a new stage of humanity,
Intellect.
like humanity 2.0. Like, there was a time when humans needed their emotions to guide them and keep them on the right path morally and so on. But now we've upgraded to a new level where we can just operate by just sheer intellect and so on, and not have need for these silly emotions. And it wasn't until a couple of years after that that I was actually diagnosed, and I got paperwork, and the paperwork said antisocial personality disorder on it, after they gave me the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, a series of psychological
Right.
evaluations. And even then I didn't know what that was, right? Antisocial personality disorder sounds like you're not very social, right? And I was thinking, I don't like people that much. I'd rather be on my own,
Right.
reading a book or something like this. And so it wasn't even until years after that that I was looking up and I saw the word sociopath,
Okay.
and I was like, what's the actual definition of a sociopath? And I looked up sociopath just for because I was writing something. And I looked up the definition of sociopath, and it said someone with antisocial personality disorder, a psychopath. And I was like, oh, well, that would make sense then. That would.
So that you're looking
okay.
for your picture on that dictionary.
Yeah. So So now, that's what that. Why didn't someone tell me this stuff when I was growing up? Because then, if you realize you have a problem, then you can start working on fixing that problem. If you're different from other people and defective, but you conclude that you're different because you're superior. Well, then bad things can happen, and bad things did happen.
It did happen. You ended up actually assaulting your father because of this disease and having a sense of superiority, and that you had an insight in the world that others didn't, and it led you to taking an assault on your father. But what that led you to, obviously the conviction of going to prison for that attack, actually is what led you to the Lord. That was the path that God had taken you down. Where in your prison experience how did that manifest itself to where this disease that had put you in probably the worst place, and maybe you didn't think it was the bad place at the time, but you were seeing stuff, and you met someone, a cellmate, who had a huge influence on your life.
Well, it was all connected in that early on when I started thinking that I'm superior to other people and so on, I realized that I was still acting the same way in a lot of ways, right? I still followed the same rules that lots of people followed. Don't kill, don't do certain things, and I wouldn't do them. And I was thinking, eventually, why am I following the same rules as these other people if I'm superior to these other people?
Right.
Why am I
Rules don't
following these
apply to you.
rules? Yeah. And I concluded that I'd been kind of brainwashed by them, right? That these inferior people had brainwashed me into following their rules that I didn't have to follow because I'm better than them. And keep in mind how nuts this is, right? This is just nuts. I don't have the same emotional reactions that you have. I'm superior to you because
You're
I don't
operating
get
in a
upset.
different lane completely.
Yeah.
Traffic laws,
Yeah,
nothing applies to you.
Yeah, when the entire time I'm just messed up, right? It's because I'm messed up. So over time, I became just obsessed with doing the opposite. Aristotle said, if you've got a stick that's bent too far in one direction, then in order to straighten it, you bend it in the other direction, right? Hold it there for a while. And so if you're leaning in one direction, namely following these people's rules, you got to kind of do the opposite for a while to straighten yourself out.
I've known some 3-year-olds like that.
Yeah. And so
I've got some grandchildren that do exactly that bend the rod back the other.
Yeah, so I started just trying to do the opposite of everything I'd been conditioned to do, and eventually I tried to kill my dad with a hammer. That's when I was put in a psychiatric hospital.
Right.
That's when they concluded that I'm a sociopath, and ended up in jail after that. And it was in jail that I met a Christian named Randy, and this guy. He'd gotten locked up. He'd turned himself in for 21 felonies. He became a Christian. Yeah, became a Christian and went and confessed everything he ever did, and they locked him up for 21 felonies.
And you must have looked at him and said, "You're the stupidest guy."
Yeah, but at the same time, there was something interesting about him in that he was different from everyone else in there, right? Which I respected that, right? Why would you want to be like all the sheep, right? And he was different. There would be a fight in the dorm. And I'd walk up to him and I go, "Hey, did you see that fight?" And he'd go, "No, I had turned away. I was praying that it would stop." And I was like, "What's wrong with you, man? It's like the only entertainment we have in here, and you're turning away praying for it to stop."
It's like turning off HBO. I mean, you got free channeling.
Yeah, and so anyway, one evening, Randy's on his bunk reading his Bible, and this is the first Christian I'd ever seen just sitting around reading his Bible. And so I walked up to him, and I thought I was, super smart. I said, "Hey, Randy, you know why you're reading the Bible? You're reading the Bible because you're born in the United States. If you've been born anywhere else, you believe something else. If you've been born in China, you'd be a Buddhist. If you've been born in India, you'd be a Hindu. If you've been born in Saudi Arabia, you'd be a Muslim. Because people like you believe whatever you're taught to believe." And this was just amazing because, at the time I was an atheist, and if you asked me about how the universe came into existence or how life came into existence, I believed everything I'd been taught, right? I believed everything that I'd been taught in my science classes and so on, that, the universe formed on its own, that life formed on its own.
Right.
And so I believed everything I was taught, and yet here I am, making fun of the Christian for believing what he was taught, even though he was a convert to Christianity.
Right.
And then something weird happened where Randy actually started arguing with me, and he was the first Christian that would go more than a minute or two ever. Because if I was talking to Christians when I was growing up, I would start messing with them, and they might argue very briefly, but then they would say, hey, I don't want to cause a scene. We don't want to argue over this. It's not right to argue over this, and let's just get along and so on. But Randy actually really just sits up on his bunk and starts arguing with me, and he had this annoying habit of asking me why I believed certain things that I would say. So if I would say something about Jesus, he would go, where'd you get that from? And and I would think, well, I didn't get it by studying. I didn't get it by studying the historical records of Jesus. I just heard something in church and formed a conclusion and tried to explain something away. And
We're listening to Dr. David Wood, who is a doctor of philosophy, but also, more importantly, is a Christian apologist and an expert on Islam. He's telling us about his growing up and his experience and how he has come to the Lord. We're listening to him here at KLUP and KSLR also. You can find us at God Family Country Show and AM 930 The Answer or AM 640 The Word. In David's testimony, this full testimony is on his website. Look on YouTube under Acts 17 Apologetics, or Google up on YouTube Dr. David Wood testimony. It's on the cover story, and David's in the middle. You're now engaging with your cell roommate. You're here in the prison, and he is defending his faith, which is not something you're accustomed to doing.
no, Christians would always to a person back down. The closest I ever got was my grandma, who was an operating room technician, and she one day just held her hand up and she said, when you think about everything that just goes into me moving my hand right now, she goes, isn't this amazing? And that was the closest thing I'd ever gotten to any sort of argument for a designer or anything growing up from a Christian. But Randy started, he started defending the resurrection and the existence of God and responding to the claims I was making, and I was it made me start thinking that
And he was using source documents, which is
most of what he was doing was questioning my claims, and that is very important. It's one of the most important questions Christians can ever ask is, why do you believe that? How did you come to that conclusion? Something like that.
Challenging the person who's challenging you.
Most of what we absorb, we just absorb when we're going. We hear it from our friends, we hear it from other people. Now we hear it online. I got it from a YouTube. If you got your worldview from a YouTube video or something like that, you might want to take it a step further and do a little investigating.
Right.
But we just pick things up as we go along. We never learn to question them. And all of a sudden, someone was questioning things. And Randy and I got into the world's. I couldn't beat him arguing because I didn't know enough. I wasn't used to arguing about someone who's actually, had studied some of this, and so I had this, I wanted to beat him at things. So we got into the world's first ever fasting battle.
Yes.
Which was, so far as I know, it's the world's first fasting battle. He wasn't trying to defeat me, but he would go on. He would fast for long periods, and then I would try to one up him. So Randy fasted for 7 days, nothing but water, and so. I went 10, right? I never fasted a day in my life, but all of a sudden I went 10 days on nothing but water.
We're going to let this Christian out-fast you.
Yeah, gotta beat him. And then he would fast, and then I would fast, and he would fast, and I would fast. And he noticed that I always went, a little longer than he did. And he'd ask me, what are you doing here? I was like, I don't know, it's just a coincidence that I would.
Well, the odds.
Yeah, eventually he fasted 40 days. He went 32 days on nothing but water, and then he started having like Kool-Aid and stuff to prepare himself for food again. And so they told me that Jesus had gone 40 days, and I said, all right, I'm going 42. And he's like, now I know you're just trying to beat me. I was like, yeah, I'm trying to beat Jesus. I'm going to beat Jesus too. Right? And so decided to go 42 days. I was on the 11th day when I passed out.
Whoops.
Passed out, fell over. And anyway, they stick me in a suicide cell. They know I have a mental health record, and they think I'm trying to starve myself. I'm trying to beat the Christian, right? I'm trying to beat
That's
the Christian.
Challenge.
Yeah, they think I'm trying
beat the Christians.
They think I'm trying to kill myself. So, ended up back there in a cell, and back there in the cell by myself with a bunch of books. I had an opportunity to do quite a bit of reading and studying.
We're coming to the bottom of this segment. Fascinating testimony from Dr. David Wood with Acts 17 apologetics. We're going to have some more discussions at the bottom of the hour. We want you to stick around because David's going to end up finishing up this testimony, but where it led him into meeting one of the most fascinating persons that changed his life and affected him, and many others, a gentleman by the name of Nabil Qureshi, who just passed away recently. But then we're going to take this discussion throughout his journey into the world of Islam. And as an atheist, where Jesus Christ took him from being an atheist to being a Christian apologist. And quite frankly, all of us need to be a Christian apologist. That is not something that is for those part-time Christians. We need to become more attuned to that. So stick around for the God Family Country Show. This is Roy White. We're on the Lance Hoppus God Family Country Show. Thanks for listening tonight. Please call your friends up. We're going to take a news break here at the bottom. Come on back and join us here in a few minutes. Thanks so much for listening, all of San Antonio. Go Spurs!
Perfect.
I like how I cut at that transition point, right?
You've
You've
done this a couple of
debaters pay attention to time.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, it's probably an internal clock. You probably, if I just tell you 26 minutes, okay, yeah, it's 25, 30.
No, I was looking.
I know, I agree. But yeah, Shawan does a great job of keeping straight.
The only thing, I'm going to edit out, but it's 6:30.
Oh, what did I say?
6:40.
6:40, okay.
But it's not a big deal. You only did it twice, so it's not a big deal.
Start over.
That's right, that's right. Yep, got to do the whole thing.
Nah.
No.
It's all
Okay.
They gotta do the whole thing.
All right, you ready?
Makes us all look.
Welcome back to the God, Family, and Country Radio Show. This show is a call for all Christians to live as God has commanded. This is a call for the recommitment to your family to pray together and live a Christian life. This is a call to action in defense of our country, our Constitution, the amendments, and the Bill of Rights, which were given to us from God. This show is sharing the message of how God, family, and country apply to you. And now, back to the God, Family, and Country Radio Show.
Well, welcome back, San Antonio, and those folks here in the Hill Country. We appreciate you tuning in here to KLUP. We appreciate all of our listeners on 930 The Answer and AM 630 TheWord.com. Thanks for joining us tonight on a fascinating discussion with Dr. David Wood, Christian apologist and Islamic expert who has debated probably over 100 times or more of Muslims, apologists, atheists, all on the topic of Christianity. And as we were saying at the bottom, all of us need to become much more aware as Christians of becoming apologists. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean apologizing. We had a little bit about that discussion offline earlier. What is apologetics actually, David?
Well, you're right. It sounds like the word there are two problems with the word apologetics. One, it sounds like it's something complicated, right?
Yeah.
Apologetics.
Yeah.
And two, it sounds like it has something to do with apologizing. But the Greek word is apologia, which was used in ancient Greek courts, and it referred to the speech of the defense. So once the accusations have been brought out, your defense of your client was called your apologia. So if Plato's Apology, for instance, refers to Socrates' trial. Socrates is not apologizing during that trial. He enrages them and they sentence him to death. But he is defending his life and the things that he'd done in Athens. And similarly, in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, when it says, and Paul stood up to give his defense before the Roman leader, the word for defense there is apologia. It's his defense. But it came to have a wider meaning of sort of defending your position, and that's how we see it used in 1 Peter 3:15, which is where we get our term apologetics from. The Apostle Peter says that we should always be prepared to give a defense or give an answer to everyone who asks us for a reason for the hope that we have. So if someone says, "Why do you believe this stuff? Why are you so hopeful? Why do you have such hope for the future?" Peter says that we're to give an apologia, which is a defense. And so this means that if we think about why we have the hope that we have, it would be because we believe in God, because we believe in a God who loves us, because we believe in a God who entered this world to die for our sins. We believe that he's going to raise us from the dead, and so it's all of these beliefs, and we're supposed to be able to give a defense for this. And so that's what apologetics is. It's giving a rational defense for Christian beliefs. And what's interesting is two things about this, because you said that people, this is for Christians in general. This isn't
Right.
for some sort of special class. One, Peter directs this towards everyone, right? He's speaking to his audience, and he says, always be ready to give a defense. So he's not saying, hey, a couple people among you need to be ready to give a defense.
Right.
So that's one interesting thing. The other thing is, think about who's saying this, right? The Apostle Paul was a brilliant scholar. Paul spoke multiple languages and could debate with the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers of his time. So Paul's a brilliant scholar, but Paul's not the one here saying, hey, everyone needs to be ready to give an apologia. This is Peter, a fisherman, right? So think about this. This is not some super educated,
Right.
brilliant scholar. This is a fisherman saying, you need to be able to give a defense for the hope that you have. And also think about this, right? If you ask the Apostle Paul, hey, why do you believe in Christianity? You're going to get a good response. But guess what? You can turn to the fisherman, the Apostle Peter, and say, hey, Peter, I think that Christianity is stupid. What do you have to say about that? Guess what? You're going to get a really good response from this fisherman. And so the implication, this is just for everybody, right? Christians, from the brilliant scholars like the Apostle Paul, down to normal working people,
Right.
people like the Apostle Peter, everyone has to be able to give a defense. And guess what? Everyone can give a defense. Everyone can give a defense.
Because
of
it's
what we
right
believe.
there for us. And we're listening to Dr. David Wood. I encourage you to go to YouTube, Google up Dr. David Wood, Acts 17, Apologetics. You're going to see over 600 videos, 42 million views of those videos. You're going to find out how his story unfolds, and we were in the middle of that story where you had now been set aside from the regular prison population after having been sentenced for sociological behavior toward your father, i.e. attacking him with a hammer. And now you're in prison, you're in isolation, and this Christian has really put you in a unique situation where he's challenged you, and you're now in this isolation beginning to study the Bible and others. And what occurred in this isolation?
Yeah, we called them camera cells because there was a camera pointing at you the entire time, so they could watch you if they think you're suicidal or something
Right.
like that. So I'm back there in this camera cell, and I realized, hey, I've got some time. I can't play cards anymore. I can't, we're not going to be playing cards or chess or anything else. Watching TV. And back here, I have absolutely nothing to do. This would be a good time to
Build my defense up against.
Yeah, to learn to respond to Randy's. If you think you're the smartest person in the world, you obviously can't get beat by some Christian in jail, right? And so I had to. The only reason he was successful when he was arguing with me just must have been that he knew more than I did. And so the solution was for me to actually learn what's in his books and so on. So lots of people don't know this. Jails have awesome libraries usually and so on. So I got books. I got a Bible study series, a set of Bible studies from the chaplain there, and started going through those, working my way through these materials, and along the way, a lot of things happened. And by the way, I wasn't just reading those; I was reading the works of Plato and Stoic philosophers, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, and so on.
Oh, sure, the normal reading you would
Yeah.
find most prisoners reading in prison.
Yeah.
I'm sure those you had to wait in line to get those books.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a waiting list.
yeah. I had to give a lot of cigarettes for those to get those books. So back there and doing lots of reading and so. And by the way, those things did have, even those books had an impact. Reading Socrates and when he's about to die and he starts defending his belief in the afterlife, and I wasn't convinced by his argument, but I thought it was interesting that one of the smartest people in history is arguing for an afterlife. And Epictetus, who was a Stoic philosopher, he's arguing for a moral law that we have to follow. And I wasn't convinced by that either, but it made me, got me thinking about about objective moral values and things like that. But it was basically three things really got me thinking. But one of them was I was sitting in my cell, and I was just staring at the wall one day. And because I'd been in the same cell like 8 months earlier, and my cellmate and I had written things all over the wall, and they were still there, and I was just staring at the rambling things we had written on the wall and so on. But then I was looking at the bricks stacked up on one on top of each other, and I was thinking, if someone told me that these bricks just went into this order on their own, I'd smack them in the mouth for saying something so stupid. And yet I believe that life formed on its own, and yet life is so vastly more sophisticated than a bunch of bricks stacked on top of each other. I mean, that's like a joke, right? Brick. I mean, anyone can just stack bricks up on one another. But life is I mean, even the simplest life is so much more complicated than that. And yet I had just accepted it without question. My teacher told me life formed on its own, so I just, okay, life formed on its own. And that's what I meant when I said that all of this is tied together. That early on, I'm trying to I think that I've been brainwashed into believing certain into following certain moral claims and so on. But now I was thinking, oh, wait a minute, I've kind of been polluted by other things, right? That I just accepted as I went along, and so that made me start questioning my beliefs that I'd held for quite a while. So that was one thing. It got me thinking about the design argument. The second thing that kind of happened was thinking about the sort of different moral issues. I realized that there was a kind of tension in it's more than a tension. Back then I would have said it's a kind of, I would have recognized a kind of tension. It's an actual, just outright contradiction that I believed, as an atheist, I believe that life is ultimately meaningless, that there is no real objective moral standard, that these kinds of claims are just a product of culture, that you have certain moral views that might be hardwired into you biologically, like a herd instinct where we kind of defend other members of our species and so on because that helped our ancestors survive, and so we're kind of hardwired to have a certain moral sense. But other than that, I mostly just thought, our society conditions us to have certain moral views. Well, that means there is no real moral position. So I believed that, and yet I also believed I'm the most important, greatest human being who's ever existed, and I'm the new level. But I mean, think about that, right? What sense does it make to say, I'm the greatest, most important thing in a world with no standards, where nothing is really better than anything else? And so that started to break down, and so I started realizing I have a problem. And keep in mind, at the same time, I'm reading about Jesus. I'm reading about Jesus every day.
A very different kind of person than you probably had an impression of.
Yeah, and you can't. I mean, unless you're just a total. I mean, let me put it this way: I was a wacko and a sociopath, and I started recognizing that Jesus was cool. If you just have a complete contempt for Jesus, you're worse off than I was. But I'm sitting there reading about Jesus, and you couldn't help but think this is a cool guy, right? This guy's cracking me up, and some of the things he's saying and stuff like this, and some of his engagements with other people. So even I was liking some of the things Jesus did, and somewhere along those lines, I ended up in kind of a dilemma, and basically two things. One, if I'm right, and there is no just moral standard of right and wrong, good and bad, it's all just molecules in motion, and we happen to think certain ways about them because we've been biologically and socially conditioned, but there's no real standard. If there's no real standard, then I'm not better than anyone else, and I'm just an idiot for doing the things I've done. Or there is some sort of moral standard, and if there is, then Jesus is obviously better than I am, right? So, in which case I'm obviously not the greatest person in the world. So either I'm wrong or I'm wrong, but either way I'm wrong, right? And so, but I mean, keep in mind, I've based my entire life and the things I've done on these things that I believe, and they start just breaking down with obvious contradictions and everything else in them.
And you end up finding yourself finally coming to the conclusion that what you're finding in this Bible and all the former myths that you thought were out there.
Well, so that's the third thing, and that was namely the resurrection. I had from the if I was at my grandma's, we would have to go to church on Easter, so I would hear the resurrection presentation on Easter, and I had very early on explained that away, right? So and it's not difficult to do if you don't know what you're talking about, but I had explained Christianity away like this. Jesus had a bunch of dedicated followers, and then he was killed by the Romans. But his followers really wanted to keep his message going. They wanted to keep the movement alive. And so in order to keep the movement alive, they made up a story about Jesus rising from the dead, because that would
Keep the
make
narrative
people
going.
interested in his message and then keep the teachings going. And so, bam, Christianity explained. But I'd found out from Randy and from some of the materials that the apostles died some horrible deaths. The majority of them were tortured and killed for their claim that Jesus had appeared to them, risen from the dead. And someone being willing to die for something, that doesn't make it true. Terrorists blow themselves up for Allah. That doesn't make what they believe true. But it does mean that they really believe it, right? Because keep in mind, my explanation was they made this up. They lied about this in order to keep a movement going.
Right.
Well, if you're going out and dying horrible, bloody deaths for something you made up, well, that doesn't tell me that what you're saying is true. It does tell me you really believe it, right?
Right.
So when a terrorist flies a plane into a building, that doesn't tell me that Islam is true. It does tell me he really believes in Islam. He's not going to be blowing himself up for Islam if he doesn't really believe in Islam. So the apostles were in kind of a different position for most people. If a Muslim today or a Christian today or a Buddhist today or anything today is willing to die for what they believe in, they believe in that because they heard a message at some point and they believed it, and they believed it so clearly true that they're willing to die for it. So the things we believe in today that we die for, the apostles weren't dying for something that they heard.
Yeah.
They were dying for something they saw. They said they saw a man.
Right.
And so if I'm asking, about a Muslim or a Christian, how did this person get this strong conviction? Well, I can explain how he got that strong conviction. He heard the message, it made sense to him, he believed it, something like that. If I'm asking that about the apostles, how did these guys come to the conclusion that they had seen a man risen from the dead?
First person.
How did they come to that conclusion? This isn't something they heard from others.
Right.
It's something they saw. What could make them see that? And there are people who will say, they all hallucinated the same thing. That's a massive. By definition, a hallucination is something that's in your mind. It's not out there in the world. So how are all these people seeing the same exact thing? So they will explain. There's even one actual scholar who says that Jesus must have had a long lost twin brother who showed up right after he died, and then resurfaced and then convinced people that Jesus had risen from the dead.
As well as the hundreds of people who were, in non-scripture writings that talk about witnessing it.
So those are the lengths that people are going to explain it, and the reason is they're explaining. We know historically Jesus died. That's what happens when you are crucified by the Romans. And two, what's interesting is scholars across the board, atheist scholars, agnostic scholars, if they're actually historical Jesus or New Testament scholars, regardless of their theological position, everyone across the board acknowledges that Jesus' apostles were convinced that he had appeared to them risen from the dead.
Right.
And so the question is, what convinced all these men? And I tried to figure it out, and I couldn't think of anything that could convince these people to give them that level of conviction where you can torture them and kill them decades later and they won't back off their claim. Because think about this, if you saw some shady figure in a corner or something like this and you thought, oh, Jesus rose from the dead, something like that, if you've got decades to think about that and you're being tortured, you have a lot of reason to sit back and think, did I really see that? Was that really Jesus? So whatever it is had such an impact on them that even after decades, these guys won't back down. What could do that? And I couldn't think of anything else than they actually saw him. And so those three things basically undermined almost everything I believed about everything else. And it got to the point where, I kind of do a tally of where my beliefs have gotten me and so on. I'm thinking, look at this. I'm in a cell for bashing my dad's head in. I sit around thinking about torturing people half the day. I'm 150 pounds, and for those people who can't see me, I'm about 250 or so pounds. I'm
6'4".
Yeah, I'm a big guy, and I was about 235 at the end of high school. And so when I'm down to 150, I'm looking like pretty pathetic. My skin
Right.
turned yellow. I got shingles all over me. It feels like poison ivy. I was scratching myself bloody. If I would stand up, I would fall over, pass out, hit my head. Again, that's how they originally put me in there. I passed out right in front of a guard. And so I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I really think I'm the best person in the world?
I'm the best it's going to get.
I'm the best? I'm the top of the food chain here?
We're talking to Dr. David Wood, Christian apologist and Islamic expert. And we're going to be talking in a little bit in the next hour about his journey into the world of Islam and how he's become one of the leading spokespersons of helping Christians and others talking about Islam and explaining Islam that all of us. So we want you to stick around, but and prison is, when you leave prison, you're supposed to be in a better state. And obviously, as you came out of prison and you chose to continue this journey of faith, and you went off to college, you went off and pursued higher learning, and one of the folks that you met in that journey was a gentleman by the name of Nabil Qureshi, and that experience of working with him or being with him. Tell us briefly in the remaining minutes we've got in this segment, tell us about your experience with Nabil and how that changed and where that journey led you into looking at Islam in a much more critical way, not just Christianity.
Well, I'd had some experience with Muslims in jail and prison, so I became a Christian in jail, but I still had years left to serve for attacking my dad. And so I ended up becoming friends with an imam who was an inmate, who was also the imam of the Muslim community there in the prison, and got into some initial discussions of Islam then while I was still in prison.
Okay.
But then when I got out, so I went straight to college after serving my prison sentence, and ended up sharing a hotel room with a Muslim named Nabil Qureshi on a school trip. We were both on the speech and debate team, and so we went on a school trip and shared a hotel room. And this was the first Muslim I knew after getting out of prison. And Nabil was putting away his prayer rug, so that told me that at least he's devout enough to have a prayer rug.
Right.
Because if someone's got the name Nabil Qureshi, that doesn't tell you a lot, right? They could be a kind of cultural Muslim. He could be an atheist who just happened to have a Muslim name, or he could be very devout. So he could be all kinds of things. So I saw him putting away his prayer rug, and okay, he's probably a sincere Muslim. And so I'm over there on my bed. I'm reading the Bible in a year, and Nabil told me later that I was the first Christian he'd ever seen reading his Bible. So I thought that was an interesting parallel. That I got into a discussion with a guy who's the first Christian I ever saw reading a Bible, and Nabil started discussing things with me. I was the first Christian he ever saw reading a Bible, but I was reading the Bible and I was praying. I said, God, if you want me to talk to this guy, just let him start it, because I don't want to be accused of messing with Muslims and being an Islamophobe and things like that. So a little later, Nabil says, "So, are you a hardcore Christian?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And that weekend, Nabil tried to educate me about Christianity, and then the whole time I'm thinking, you have any clue who you're messing with, dude? I just spent years, going through this, to decide whether I was going to become a Christian, but then spent years, studying apologetics and so on. And now you're trying to tell me about Christianity. And, it's a similar situation to what I was in before I was locked up. Nabil just heard all these things growing up and happens to believe them and didn't question them and so on. And so Nabil gave me his sort of defense of Islam, and Islam is proven true by, reason and logic and science and history and
which was
everything.
right up your alley.
Everything proves that Islam is true. And he finished his speeches on on how obvious Islam is, that it's true. And after all that, I said, I have a question for you. If you're wrong, do you want to know it? And that's an important question to ask.
Of anybody these days.
Yeah. Because there are people who will say, no, I don't want to know it. In which case, okay, let's talk about the football game, because you don't care about these things very much. Nabil said yes and no. He said, yes, I would want to know the truth about God, but no, it would destroy my family. But notice he did say yes, he would want to know the truth about God, and so we sort of agreed early on that there are basically three possibilities here: either I'm right and he's wrong, or he's right and I'm wrong, or we're both wrong. Under no circumstances are we both right.
Right.
And that if one of us happens to be right here, then maybe we are not friends by coincidence here. Maybe we're not sharing a hotel room by coincidence here. Maybe one of us is here under God's sovereignty to show the other person the truth. And so we kind of concluded that we have an obligation, a spiritual, intellectual obligation, to get to the bottom of this and to stick together until we get to the bottom of this. And so we kept that up for years, and eventually Nabil became a Christian.
Absolutely, and that's the good news that Jesus Christ has for all of us, in discussing it and being an apologetic witness like you were. All of us have that within us, and we're so pleased to have Dr. David Wood. In the next hour, we're going to come back and discuss a whole range of topics about Islam and Christianity and where we stand as a nation, as a world of Christians. You're listening to the Lance Hoppus Show. This is Roy White standing in for Lance Hoppus. You're listening on KSLR 630 AM and KLUP 930 The Answer. We want you to come back after the top of the hour. We're going to take a little news break. We're going to talk about jihad. We're going to talk about really who this Muhammad person is, what his life was like, and David's going to dissect that and give us some information that I think all of us can use, and what we as Christians need to know about Islam, not just in terms of witnessing to other Muslims, but how we can become apologetic about our faith and helping use that information to bring Christ into the hearts of more Muslims here in the United States, because they're among us here, folks. We do not need to be fearing Muslims. We need to be loving Muslims, just like Jesus Christ asked us to go witnessing to the whole world. The whole world is upon us. So come back and listen to Dr. David Wood. Thanks for listening. Listen to the top of the show in the news, and we'll be right back.
All right, here we go.
Welcome back to the God, Family, and Country radio show. This show is a call for all Christians to live as God has commanded. This is a call for the recommitment to your family to pray together and live a Christian life. This is a call to action in defense of our country, our Constitution, the amendments, and the Bill of Rights, which were given to us from God. This show is sharing the message of how God, family, and country apply to you. And now, back to the God, Family, and Country radio show.
Well, welcome back, San Antonio and the Hill Country. We're glad to have you listening here on the second hour of the Lance Hoppus God, Family, Country Show. Roy White here, retired Air Force. Glad to be back with you, hosting in place of Lance, who's on the road with his lovely wife. We want you to tune in, tell your friends to dial up the radio show tonight, AM630theword.com. They can listen to us over the internet or on their AM dial. AM 930, The Answer, also at KLUP. So we're just very pleased that you took the time out of your night to be listening to us here in San Antonio. We're honored and pleased to have Dr. David Wood, Doctor of Philosophy from Fordham University, and he is sitting here with us tonight in studio. Just gave us his captivating testimony. If you missed the first hour, you can go back and listen to it on the podcast on GodFamilyCountryShow.com. You can go there and listen to that, or go to KLUP or KSLR, their websites, and pull up the podcast and listen to that first hour. Or you can go to David's website, which is on the YouTube channel. If you'll go to YouTube, Google up Dr. David Wood, Christian Apologetics, the Acts 17 Christian Apologetics. Google that up, as well as go to YouTube, search for that. You'll find his testimony that we've just kind of covered in the first hour. But what I want to spend this next 2 segments on is really talking about what we as Christians need to understand about Islam. So let's first of all, let's talk about the 3 elements that make up what Islam consists of. Most people think that Islam, you can define Islam about what's in the Quran, but what are the 3 key elements that make up the faith and the ideology of Islam? David? Briefly a summary of those.
I'm not sure which specific 3 things you're referring to, because I can think of a lot. Oh, if you're talking about the Quran and Muhammad.
And the Hadiths, as well as the life of Muhammad, the Sunnah.
So are you talking about like sources?
Yes.
Sources?
Yeah.
Well, the Muslims have, we hear about the Quran. We think
Right.
that's like parallel to the Bible. Muslims have a different view of the inspiration. The Quran is believed by Muslims to be an eternal book in Allah's presence. So always keep that in mind. There's more than one eternal thing in Islam. But you have Allah, and with Allah is always His book, the Quran. So, as Christians, we believe God inspires human authors to write. But in Islam, a prophet like Muhammad is basically a mailman. He received the message from the angel Gabriel, who was also a mailman, with respect to the message. So Gabriel gets it, and then he delivers it to Muhammad, and then Muhammad delivers it to his followers, and then the followers, eventually, compile it into the Quran.
Right.
But there's no human input into the Quran. It is the
Completely
word of Allah. But it also says in the Quran that Muslims have to obey everything, all of Muhammad's decisions.
Right.
And the Quran, chapter 33, verse 21, says that Muhammad is the pattern of conduct for Muslims. So if you want to imitate this pattern, if you want to be like Muhammad, then you need to know about Muhammad's life. And if you want to know what Muhammad's decisions are that you're supposed to follow, you have to know what Muhammad decided. And the Quran isn't what Muhammad decided, that's what Allah decided. And so you have to go outside the Quran. And so you also have other sources. You have the Hadith and the Sirah. The Sirah works, the Sirah literature. These are sort of biographical accounts of the life of Muhammad. And the Hadiths are usually arranged topically, but there'll be collections of what Muhammad said or did given on specific topics that's relevant to specific topics. So there'll be, everything Muhammad said about marriage, everything Muhammad said about jihad.
Right.
It'll be arranged topically.
Washing your hands, everything that
going to the bathroom. It's all
exactly. And I try to explain it sometimes to people. I said, in the Gospels you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, who were first-person witnesses, but some people will say, well, the Gospels are like the Hadiths. But I said, the difference is, yes, those are descriptions of what Jesus did in his example, but those were from first-hand experiences. The stories that we're getting of the Hadiths are stories that were told over time, and they were not recorded until many years after Muhammad's death. So
yeah, the main Hadith collections that Muslims go to are Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, which were written about 2 centuries after Muhammad's death. So you're talking, these stories are passed on for about 2 centuries before they're compiled by Bukhari and Muslim.
And imagine if we were just now beginning to write U.S. history from George Washington days and saying, oh, this is what they said, this is what they did, this is the behavior, from stories that were passed upon. And we all know what it's like passing stories through various generations. And in the case of Muhammad, and listing all the things that he did in his life, the further you go away from his life, there's more detail about, and which is completely opposite.
Yeah, that is a problem. The first generation is supposed to know the most about the person, whereas in Islam, the farther you go away from Muhammad, the more they seem to know about Muhammad. Yeah. So where are you guys getting this information? We have your earlier sources. It says less. Where are you getting the extra information as time goes on? And what's interesting here is Muslims will treat the Gospels as their, as unreliable. And
right.
How can you trust a gospel written 2 or 3 decades after the time of Jesus. You guys are trusting sources 2 or 3 centuries after the time of Muhammad, and those are the sources you treat as best on the life of Muhammad. Think about this. Christians don't use a source on the life of Jesus outside the 1st century. We don't go to a 3rd century source and say, hey, let's look at this 3rd century source and trust what it says. And guess what? There are sources like that, right? There are the Gnostic Gospels, and all these other people wrote things about Jesus later on. We don't trust those things at all. We say they're too late. You weren't there. Whereas Muslims, the best sources that they use, their favorite sources, are written 2 to 3 centuries after the time of Muhammad, and they regard this as their strongest material. So, guys, Muslims, if you're trusting sources 2 or 3 centuries after the time of Muhammad, all the more you should trust 1st century sources about the life of Jesus.
Well, we have this dilemma, and as Christians, there is a natural, as Christians, we should be feeling a love, a desire to help all. And yet in our culture, what we hear about Muslims or Islam is so negative that as Christians, I think there's a natural barrier that begins to be built up, that we're afraid of dealing with Muslims, we're afraid of engaging or asking the right questions. And yet that misconception that Muslims aren't willing to engage or aren't willing to have a discussion, but it's not something you can go out and beat somebody over the head with and have that discussion. As a culture, Muslims are very warm, very friendly to those of their own faith, but even in many cultures, and there's many different sects and dialects and sects of Muslims around the country, around the world, not just Arabs only make up, 17% of all Muslims around the world. I believe that's the correct number. So we have this situation that here in the United States, we have many Muslims that we're surrounded by. How do we overcome the fear that I think many people have, as we're talking about as Christians, to overcome that fear and begin to understand what Islam and what Muslims really mean? How do we overcome that, David?
We basically, you've got 2 problems. One, you have sort of general, reluctance on the part of Christians to talk about Christianity now. It's been sort of beaten down and told, hey, this is offensive. Don't bring up these topics. You're going to hurt people's feelings. You're bad if you bring these topics up. And then with specifically towards Muslims, on the one hand, you have people who are worried that Muslims going to kill them or something like this, or these guys jihadis, are they going to chop my head off for talking to them? But also, culturally as well, we're told if you're talking to Muslims, it must be because you're a racist or a bigot or a hate monger or something like that. Now think about how silly that is, right? If you're sharing the gospel with a Muslim, it's because you want the Muslim to know Jesus and to be with you for all eternity. What sense would that make if you really just hate these people?
Right.
So as far as getting over it, Christians need to just take a step back and think, if I'm reluctant to share the gospel with people, where did I get that reluctance? Have I been socially conditioned to be ashamed of my faith? If so, I need to take account of what my society has told me and think, should I be following what they tell me right now?
There's a lot of things that you find in the Quran that you would also find in our Bible, that intersection of the Quran and the Bible are potentially entry points for Christians to be able to talk to other Muslims. Let's talk about some of those cross points that we as Christians can use and engage in starting those dialogues. Jesus is talked about in the Quran extensively. Tell us a little bit about what the Quran says about Jesus, what Muslims view Jesus as versus what we as Christians view Jesus as.
Well, you're right. There's a lot of similarities, and it's interesting. Some of the similarities are things where they agree with us on issues that no one else agrees with us on. So, according to the Quran, Jesus is born of a virgin. Who else agrees with us that Jesus was born of a virgin? According to the Quran, Jesus lived the most miraculous life in history. He cured the lepers, gave sight to the blind, raised the dead. according to the Quran. Whereas according to the Quran, Muhammad couldn't perform any miracles other than delivering the Quran.
Right.
So Jesus is the most miraculous person in the Quran.
And he's revered by Muslims as a prophet. One of the many prophets is talked about in the and they talk about many other prophets besides just Jesus.
Yeah, and Jesus is also the Messiah according to the Quran. So you've got someone who is born of a virgin, lives the most miraculous life in history. He's the Messiah, and he has a miraculous end to his life as well. The people are trying to kill him, and he's miraculously rescued by Allah. Whereas Muhammad, most Muslims don't know. Most people don't know this in general, but Muhammad was poisoned by a Jewish woman after her family was slaughtered by Muslims, and she said, "Hey, I'd like to cook you a meal." Muhammad said, "Okay," and she poisons his food. It doesn't kill him immediately, but it does some sort of internal damage that actually kills him a couple years later. And this comes from Muhammad. Muhammad's the one saying he died. But notice, even according to Islam, Jesus is miraculously rescued by Allah when people are trying to kill him, but Muhammad is killed by poisoning. So it's very interesting, the comparisons there. But so they agree with us on a lot of things that are just amazing. It's amazing to have that common ground. But the flip side there is where they disagree with us is exactly where you would expect them to disagree with us if Muhammad's a false prophet, because if you read the book of Acts, the takeaway message according to the apostles, so the people who knew Jesus then went out and started preaching the gospel after his death and resurrection, and the message that they preached, it always centered around Jesus died on the cross for sins, he rose from the dead, now you submit to him as Lord. So it's death, deity, and resurrection. Death, deity, and resurrection, wherever they preached. So those were the key elements of the Christian gospel. It's no coincidence that that's what the Apostle Paul says. You confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead. Notice, Jesus is Lord, God has raised him, resurrection from the dead, death. No, it's the same exact takeaway message that was the takeaway message according to Jesus' original followers. And so that's the gospel. But we're also told in the New Testament that false teachers and false prophets are going to come, lead people away from that message. And here comes Muhammad, 6 centuries later. Yes, and he says, "Hey, you Christians, you believe in God? So do I. You believe in all these prophets? So do I. You believe God sends revelations? So do I. You believe Jesus is born of a virgin? So do I. You believe he lived the most miraculous life in history? So do I. You believe he's the Messiah? So do I. In fact, there are only these 3 things that we have to disagree on.
Just
3 little things. One, Jesus didn't die on the cross, he didn't rise from the dead, and he's not Lord. If we can just agree on those things, then we're good to go." And so, the Christian...
You won't ever have that. You won't ever have those 3 things brought up in an interfaith dialogue discussion. No. Those are prohibited, because that's going to the rabbi.
It's hey, we believe in Jesus. We love Jesus. We love Mary. There's an entire chapter of the Quran named after Mary. You see our common ground here. So the Christian response should be, "Wow, we've been waiting for you, because you are the most perfect example in history, Muhammad.
We should be arm in arm
of a false prophet, right? I mean, we couldn't ask for a more perfect false prophet. A prophet who agrees with us on everything except for the 3 core elements of the Christian gospel that we're told false prophets are going to come and try to corrupt."
We're listening to Dr. David Wood, Christian apologetic here at KSLR and KLUP. We want you to go to his YouTube site. Go to YouTube, Google up Dr. David Wood, Acts 17 Apologetics Ministry. You'll find over 600 videos, including a discussion on this very topic there with over 42 million views. We're just pleased to have you. This is Roy White with G416 Patriots. We want you to contact us if you want more information. We have a copy of David's presentation. He made 2 presentations this past week on the Christians to challenge Islam biblically. We have that presentation that he gave last week at Village Parkway Baptist Church. And we also have his discussion about violence in Christianity and Islam. So 2 great presentations that will be up on the YouTube videos that will be discussing him. But for tonight, we're really having a really kind of an in-depth discussion about what we as Christians need to know about Islam. And one of the things that we hear in the news an awful lot about is the word jihad. And jihad really is defined as holy war in terms of Muslims taking the holy war, spreading the name of Allah through this method. And it's used in a lot of places in common day language where the apologist will say, well, it's an inner struggle. It's this inner battle that, I have my jihad overcoming my weight, or finding peace in my own inner self. And yet the Quran speaks very definitively about what jihad really means. What is the Quran, what are the sources, Islamic sources, not talking heads, say about the concept of jihad?
Well, jihad does mean struggle. So a struggle in Islam can be a jihad. So you can have a jihad to go to the gym or something like this,
Sure.
right? You can have it can refer to an inner struggle. But the claim is it can refer to an inner struggle, therefore that's all it
Right.
refers to, and that's absolute nonsense according to the Muslim sources. Take chapter 9, verse 73 of the Quran, which commands Muslims to wage jihad against both unbelievers and hypocrites, and to be unyielding towards them. This is not talking about your inner struggle towards unbelievers and hypocrites, because you're told repeatedly in Surah 9 of the Quran that you have to go out and fight and subjugate the unbelievers. So chapter 9, verse 29, fight those who do not believe in Allah, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden, which hath been forbidden to Allah and His Messenger. Forbidden by Allah and His Messenger. It specifically refers to Jews and Christians and says to fight us until we pay the jizya and acknowledge that we are subdued. We're a subjugated class. So there's a command to violently subjugate Jews and Christians. The command to wage jihad in 973, wage jihad against the unbelievers, obviously doesn't refer to some internal spiritual struggle against your own sinful desires or something like that. So there are places in the Quran where it obviously refers to armed struggle against unbelievers for the sake of making Islam superior to all other religions and dominating the world.
And for those who say, well, that's just an interpretation, yet we have many other places in the Quran that talks about the Quran, the Word of God is very clear. There's no question about those words come out in several different verses that you talked about.
Yeah, there are several surahs that begin. These are the words of the clear book. And so Allah brags throughout the Quran that His commands are perfectly clear. So if He says, fight those who do not believe in Allah, lots of Muslims in the West are going to say, oh, what He really means when He says, fight those who do not believe in Allah, what He really means is fight people who are attacking you. Well, guess what? If Allah is really clear, if His commands are clear, if He meant fight those who are attacking you, that if He's clear, He should have said fight those who are attacking you, because that's kind of important. Just think about this, because Muslims would never accept this response from anyone else. If Donald Trump came out tomorrow and did an announcement and said, we will fight those who believe in Allah, there would be international uproar. All of the media would be shouting this from the rooftops. Donald Trump just said we must fight those who believe in Allah. And suppose he came out and said, well, what I really meant was fight, just those specific terrorists who happen to be attacking us. No one would accept that as a defense. They would say, look, if you're talking about fighting and killing people and subjugating people, you need to be crystal clear about what you're talking about here. You can't be giving sort of general language that would just apply to all kinds of people that you're not targeting. That is unacceptable. And yet, that's exactly what they tell us about Allah. So Allah is supposed to be the clearest communicator in all of history. And yet he said he apparently has some sort of cosmic Tourette syndrome where he keeps blurting out all these commands to violently subjugate people, and he doesn't really mean any of it. He doesn't want to say that. He's trying to say fight in self-defense. He's trying to say only fight people who are attacking you, but it comes out fight those who do not believe.
Well, I think this is, and it was one of why I got into this, entire struggle that I've been on, my own,
your jihad,
my jihad, and that is we have the words, we have the simple Islamic sources that tell us exactly what's going on. What we don't do is share that. Our national leaders have not gone to the experts to understand that, to listen clearly as a blueprint about what Islam is all about. Fortunately, most Muslims don't necessarily follow that for a variety of reasons. And I think one of the more powerful videos that you've made is the Jihad Triangle that talks about what are the three key elements that are required to really turn that Muslim neighbor that we have or some theoretical Muslim who's there, who is peaceful, who is not doing anything to harm you or I, and yet, if these three elements are in place, it becomes a problem. Let's talk about the jihad triangle for a moment.
Well, that was really, that video was made in response to just a common, silly objection. If there's a terrorist attack and you start saying, Muhammad said that he'd been made victorious with terror. Allah commands Muslims to terrorize their enemies and so on. This is a tactic in Islam. This has something to do with the Muslim sources. The response is, but I have Muslim friends and they're not like that. Therefore, that's not what Islam teaches. And that's so incredibly silly, right? This is like me saying, hey, I know a Christian who's very unloving. Therefore, Christianity doesn't tell you to be loving. What a person is doing does not dictate.
Define.
Yeah, the religious views of Christianity and Islam have been defined a long, long time ago. They're written down, right? What a person does or does not do today does not impact what the religion teaches. But the question arises: why aren't, if Islam commands jihad, why aren't all Muslims waging jihad?
Sure.
Or if Christianity tells you to love your enemies, why don't all Christians love their enemies? And the reason is there's more at work here than simply believing that Christianity is true or believing that Islam is true. And so basically jihad is not a product of one single factor, belief in Islam, because that's the idea. Well, if someone believed in Islam and it taught terrorism, then they would all be terrorists or something like that. There's more at work here. And so jihad isn't just a product of one factor, it's a product of three factors. One would be belief in Islam. You're not going to wage jihad if you don't believe that Islam is true. But there are other components, and the second one would be knowledge. You have to actually know. Most Muslims don't know. They have a mistaken view of what Islam teaches about fighting unbelievers and so on. And so obviously, even if they believe in Islam, but they lack the knowledge of what it teaches, then they're not going to wage jihad. But even then, there's a third component, and that would be a kind of obedience. There are different personality types in this world. Some people are just wired that whatever my religion teaches or whatever I happen to believe, I'm ready to lay down my life for it. And other people are, hey, I believe my religion teaches this, but I don't want it to mess up my life. They have different personality types. So as far as getting jihad, it's not just, hey, I happen to believe in Islam. One, you have to believe in Islam. Two, you have to know what Islam teaches about jihad and about how you're to deal with unbelievers. And three, you have to have a certain personality type where, and this personality type can be used for good, right?
Obedience,
Martin Luther King Jr., that's a person who's willing to lay down his life for what he believes. But when that is combined, when that sort of personality type is combined with belief in Islam and an understanding of what jihad is, that's when you get
all the ingredients necessary to turn that person.
That's when someone's going to wage jihad. And so guess what? For most people, you don't have all of those three elements combined. You might have one of them, maybe two of them, but not all three. When you have all three, you get a jihadi.
You have this combustible mix. And we're talking to Dr. David Wood with Acts 17 Christian Apologetics. This is Roy White standing in for Lance Hoppes on the Lance Hoppes God Family Country Show. You're listening on AM 930 The Answer and AM 630 The Word. Please come back. We're going to be at the bottom of the hour. We're going to take a news break. Please listen. Catch up on all the latest news and events here going around the Hill Country, and we want you to come back and listen to the closing segment with Dr. David Wood as we begin to really unpack more about Islam and what Christians need to know about Islam and how we can continue to witness to more Muslims. Thank you. Welcome. Come on back. Okay. You've already done all the Answering Islam series. Have you put all those in a can, or have you guys? Because it looked like you did one right after.
We've recorded 26 of them so far.
26 of them?
Yeah,
Oh,
I posted. We want to go all the way to like 50 or 52, but
Wow.
52, so that there'd be one for each week of the year or something like that. But yeah, I've only posted through I think 14.
Yeah, they've been. Who did you shoot them? Because it's a different kind of setting.
Yeah, Brother Rashid, who's a former Muslim,
Uh-huh.
but yeah, his ministry recording this. It's the Al Hayat TV network. That
Wow.
they have you down.
Yeah, it's
Recording.
I mean, they're great stuff. Anyway. Okay, good. Let's hit it. We're going to talk a little bit about women. We're going to talk about these 3 Quran verses every Christian should know. So, all right.
Welcome back to the God, Family, and Country radio show. This show is a call for all Christians to live as God has commanded. This is a call for the recommitment to your family to pray together and live a Christian life. This is a call to action in defense of our country, our Constitution, the amendments, and the Bill of Rights, which were given to us from God. This show is sharing the message of how God, family, and country apply to you. And now, back to the God, Family, and Country radio show.
Well, welcome back, San Antonio. We're glad to have you back listening to us on this last segment with Dr. David Wood. Before we get back with Dr. Wood, we want to go over some useful information that you may listen to the show on a regular basis. This may be your first time. I work with a group, this is Roy White, working with a group called G416 Patriots. We have meetings, we end up discussion, bringing in experts like Dr. David Wood, talking about the challenges that are going on between Christianity and Islam. And the topics that we talk about are related to that. We come on here every week to have these discussions, and we meet on a quarterly basis at Village Parkway Baptist Church. Pastor Steve Branson, they're great. If you're looking for a church to go and find a great home with, we encourage you to look at Village Parkway Baptist Church over on Parkway off of Calabria. We will be looking for more speakers, but also we're looking for you to come to our next meeting. We had lots of folks who came out for the first time to hear David, some of his regular followers. You can reach us at G416patriots@gmail.com. G416 stands for Galatians 4:16. We want you to come out. We want to boldly tell the truth, even if it'll make us your enemy. And we talk to those rhetorically out there who don't want to hear the truth. And that's really a challenge for, as Christians, we're being challenged wherever we turn when we're talking about the faith of Jesus Christ. Christians are being persecuted not just in faraway lands, but here locally when we stand up, whether it's wearing crosses, whether it's telling the truth, or just having conversations, whether it's workplace or wherever, we're finding a reluctance for people to stand up for the faith of Jesus Christ. And we need to boldly express that and tell people with the passion and as a Christian apologist, as David has talked to us today. So you can get this full podcast at AM 630 The Word or AM 930 TheAnswer.com. You can also go to Lance's website for the GodFamilyCountryShow.com and get these podcasts downloaded and listen to this. But please write to us at G416patriots@gmail.com. So you're asking yourself, well, what can I do to be correcting and to be involved in some of these projects where I can really be doing something other than maybe sending emails or calling my congressman? Well, one way to do that is with a group called Truth in Textbooks. And what we do as a project is we take average citizens who are well-read, who are interested in trying to correct the history textbooks that our children and grandchildren are reading, and putting back the Judeo-Christian values and the stories of our history, the rich texture of our deep religious roots here in our country. And we train these individuals on how to review social studies textbooks around the country. You want to learn more on how to do that? We'll train you from your home. It won't cost you anything. We do conference calls. We do emails. We have training. And then we actually go out and help states or local school districts in pushing back and doing this with facts, not emotions, but with facts. And we put you through our training program. You could write to us at tnt.textbooks@gmail.com. Write to us, and we will put you in the next training class that will begin in January. And you will go from being a talker to being a doer. You will actually be doing something, because in the state of Texas, 5 million children today have more accurate textbooks over the next 10 years than they would have had if it hadn't have been for 50 volunteers, less than 50 volunteers, because those 50 volunteers found over 1,500 errors in the social studies textbooks that were about to be accepted by the State Board of Education in 2014. But because of those volunteers, over 60% of those errors were eliminated or corrected. And errors like some of the ones that we were talking about today, about Islam and Christianity, about Israel, removing any mention of Neil Armstrong about landing on the moon, that was not one of the significant events that we as Americans should be proud of. That we were never even aware, our children would not be aware of that. Or the fact that on 911, when it's described as having terrorists flown into the towers, and there was no mention of Islam, there was no mention of Muslims, there was no mention of Saudi Arabia's involvement. The type of information, even a casual reader would have been able to pick that up. And so we help train you. So write to us at tnt.textbooks@gmail.com. We've been working in California, Florida. We've worked with the state of North Carolina. We've identified 8 books there with 603 errors in. And the lieutenant governor there has reached out to us, and we're going to continue that work there. So we're excited about the work we're doing. And it's a way that you can get involved and do something, and not just be talking about it, but be doing something about it. And someone who's definitely doing something about educating Americans and Christians about Islam is Dr. David Wood, who's with us here tonight. So go to his YouTube channel, Google up Dr. David Wood, Acts 17 Apologetics Ministry, and you'll find. And one of those videos that are in there that I think is very useful for our listeners tonight is you have one in there that talks about the 3 Quran verses that every Christian should know. And I think that's important because it tells us a lot about what Islam is all about. Share with us what those verses are, David, if you would.
Well, that was an interesting video because I sat down and I had been thinking about 12 Quran verses every Christian should know, or 10 Quran verses every Christian should know, and telling Matt Slick about it. I'm going to make a list. 12 Quran verses every Christian should know.
12 days of Christmas. Huh?
Yeah. He said, no, cut it down. It's too much. And so anyway, I just sat down and I recorded 3 Quran verses. Like if I had to pick a top 3, I recorded. It was cool because now it's 1 point something million people have viewed that, and so it's cool because there is an interest among Christians. Specifically, that would be geared towards Christians who aren't going to dedicate a lot of their life to it, right? They're not going to go through the Muslim sources. But if I had to learn something about Islam, what would it be? And that's who it was meant for. And so I basically picked 3 Quran verses that have to do with different topics. And one was chapter 4, verse 157 of the Quran, which says that Jesus wasn't killed and wasn't crucified. And because this is important, so Christians who understand that when Muslims come and say, hey, we have all this common ground and so on, that's true, but you also have we have an important difference there. You don't believe that Jesus was killed or crucified, which is not only foundational to the gospel, it's also, a historical fact. Every historical Jesus scholar, whether agnostic or atheist or Jewish or liberal Christian or conservative Christian, across the board they acknowledge that Jesus was crucified under the reign of Pontius Pilate, and they don't just say, well, it probably happened. People like Bart Ehrman and John Dominic Crossan, these are not Christians, but they say it's one of the best established facts of history that Jesus died by crucifixion. And so the Islamic position doesn't just go against the gospel, it goes against history, and at the same time it reveals something about Allah's character, because the Muslim view is that Jesus wasn't crucified. Allah took one of Jesus' followers, usually they say Judas, and miraculously transformed his appearance so that he looked like Jesus, and was then placed on. So it was Judas who was placed on the cross.
Right.
And so the reason, and Muslims will look at this and they'll say, you see how Islam is more just. The innocent Jesus wasn't crucified. Allah got the bad guys, right? And he made it so that Judas was crucified. Isn't Islam better? Until you really point out the problem here, namely that, wait a minute, you're telling me the reason Christians down through the centuries, billions of people and non-Christians, believe that Jesus was crucified is because Allah did such a great job tricking everyone?
Right.
And that's what they're saying. Allah is this sort of amazing trickster.
It's kept this myth going.
Yeah, Allah did it, right? Why do we believe it? Because Allah tricked so many people. So one, that's one problem. The second is important because if a Christian is sharing the gospel with a Muslim, if a Christian can defend any Christian doctrine from the Bible, the Muslim has to say that the Bible's been corrupted. And so, because you have to, right? Because Muslims are aware that they believe that the Torah and the Gospel were originally the inspired Word of God, but they know that the Torah and the Gospel of today don't line up with what Islam teaches. So they have to say, well, the Torah and the Gospel were corrupted. And so Christians are going to encounter that. So I included chapter 5, verse 47. There are lots of other verses along these lines, but I had to pick one, so I picked chapter 5, verse 47. Where Allah commands, let the people of the gospel judge by what Allah has revealed therein. If any fail to judge by the light of what Allah has revealed, they are no better than those who rebel. So Allah commands the people of the gospel, that's the term for Christians.
Right.
Allah commands the people of the gospel to judge by what's in the gospel. Now what's the problem there? If we judge by the gospel, Islam is false. Right? Yeah. And so, but notice, it makes no sense if the gospel has been corrupted for Allah to say, judge by the gospel. You'd be saying judge by a corrupt book. And so when the idea there is when you preach the gospel to a Muslim and he says, oh, your book's been corrupted. Really? Why didn't Allah know that?
Yeah,
and why did he tell me to judge by this corrupt book? It shows that they've actually got a problem in their sources, which you would hopefully learn more and be able to unpack that objection more, because at the end of the day, Islam doesn't just affirm the inspiration of the Torah and the Gospel. It affirms the preservation and the authority of the Torah and the Gospel. So Islam affirms our book, and that puts Muslims in an inescapable dilemma. There are only two possibilities here. Either we have the inspired, preserved, authoritative Word of God, or we don't. If we have the inspired, preserved, authoritative Word of God, Islam is false, because Islam contradicts what we have.
And this illustrates so much about the truth to this dilemma of dealing with Islam is in their own words. I mean, we have words that can really, to win this battle. It's just so remarkable, David, what you've done.
But if there's only two possibilities here, and both of them mean that Islam is false, because if we have the inspired, preserved, authoritative Word of God, Islam is false. If we don't have the inspired, preserved, authoritative Word of God, Islam is still false, because Islam affirms the inspiration, preservation, authority of our book. So if the Bible's the Word of God, Islam's false. If the Bible's not the Word of God, Islam is false. Either way, Islam is false. Guess what? My Muslim friend who just told me that my Bible's been corrupted, you've got the problem here, not me.
It's the Quranic dilemma.
Yeah. So we wanted to bring that to the surface. And guess what? This always comes to the surface. If you're having a conversation that has anything to do with Christianity or Islam with a Muslim, he's going to tell you your Bible's been corrupted. Why wouldn't you be prepared with at least one verse, chapter 5, verse 47 of the Quran, to say, what's this mean then? Why is Allah telling me to judge by my corrupt book? And hopefully eventually bring out the entire dilemma. So those are two of the verses, and the third, obviously, would have to do something with jihad, so that people can understand jihad. And so I gave them chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran, which commands Muslims to violently subjugate Jews and Christians. For people who are looking around at the world wanting to know why you have all these terrorist attacks and why you have such hatred for Israel and such wanting to launch terrorist attacks against the West. Well, guess what? Allah commanded Muslims to wage jihad against Jews and Christians until we are a subjugated people under the authority of Islam. And so I picked those three verses for different reasons, to give examples of things Christians need to know in different areas.
We're talking to Dr. David Wood of Acts 17 Christian Apologetics Ministry. We want you to listen to his YouTube videos. There are over 600 of those found on YouTube with 42 million views. You're listening to Lance Hoppus Show here on KSLR 630 The Answer and KLUP 630 The Word, and then KLUP 930 The Answer. We want you to take a look at his website, look and get the answers to the kind of questions we're talking about. And one of those questions that we see certainly in our every day here in the San Antonio area, estimates are there are 40 to 50,000 Muslims who live here in the 7th largest city in the country, is how women are viewed in the Quran. And there's like Linda Sarsour and many others within the Muslim community who talk about how Islam treats women in such a respectful manner. You've recorded many videos, but what do we as Christians need to be aware of what not talking heads say, or the Linda Sarsours of the world, but what do the Islamic sources say about women and how did Muhammad view women?
Well, according to the Quran, the testimony of a woman is worth half the testimony of a man, which makes it very difficult in court cases for women to win court cases.
Right.
But Muhammad explained why in their most reliable hadith collections. He said, why the testimony of a woman is worth half that of a man. It's because of their intellectual deficiency. So women are stupid, according to the Quran. They're immoral. According to Muhammad, they're naturally immoral and ungrateful. Muhammad said that he had been shown a vision of hell, and most of the inhabitants were women. And he specifically said it's because that they're ungrateful to their husbands. The Quran, there's a verse of the Quran which we don't use the word tilth much anymore.
Not exactly used in everyday language.
Yeah, and it says your women are a tilth for you, so enter your tilth when or how you will. And until you understand the historical background of that verse, you don't understand how disturbing it is. The historical background was that when Muslims moved from Mecca to Medina and started marrying the women of Medina, the women of Medina only wanted to have sex in one certain position. They didn't want to be all weird and get involved in other positions. So they said, "Don't come near me in those positions." And one woman specifically told her Muslim husband, "Don't approach me if you want sex in that position." And so he brought the issue to Muhammad, and the verse about the tilth, that's revealed in a response to that question. Your wives are your tilth. Enter them when or how you will. A tilth is a patch of ground that you plow to sow your seed, right? So your women are your tilth that you plow,
Whatever.
enter however you want, right? So that's notice this is why there's not a concept of spousal rape in Islam.
Right.
Muslim scholars will make fun of that. I've heard them say, "Did you know that in America a man can actually be charged with raping his wife? How can you rape your wife? She's yours, right?" And so but in Islam, if your wife said, "I don't want to do that," well, too bad, right? You're my field for plowing my seed. So I will plow you however I want. That is according to Allah. So you have that. You have very disturbingly, chapter 4, verse 34 of the Quran, which says that if you fear rebellion from your wife, notice it's not even your wife has actually rebelled against you. If you simply fear rebellion on the part of your wife, you can warn her, you can separate from her, make her sleep in a different bed, and beat her. So you can beat your wife into submission. And the historical Muslims try to reinterpret this verse because they don't want to go with the implications, but the historical background...
Beat them lightly.
The historical background is that a woman came to Muhammad after she'd been slapped in her face, and she still had the handprint on her face, and she comes in and says, "My husband did this to me," and then Muhammad's about to judge in her favor, which would have meant that one of her relatives would be able to slap the taste out of the husband's mouth as retaliation. There would have been retaliation. But that's when Surah 4, verse 34 was revealed. Men are allowed to beat their wives. And Muhammad specifically says to the woman, "I wanted one thing, but Allah wanted something else."
Oh.
I wanted to give you justice, but Allah says, nope, he can beat you.
Sorry.
And so you have that.
Allah.
Yeah, you have that. You have the Quran repeatedly allows Muslims after battles to take the women as sex slaves. So Muslims are allowed to have not only to have sex with up to 4 wives, they can have an unlimited number of sex slaves and female captives and so on. And it's even the case with married captives. So chapter 4, verse 24 isn't very clear. It said also forbidden are women who are married unless you've captured them, right? And what that means is you can't have sex with a married woman unless she's your battle captive.
Right.
And notice it's if she's a married woman, because the situation in that battle was Muslims captured not only the women after the battle, they captured the men as well. And so Muhammad's followers, and this is in the hadiths, came to him and said, we want to have sex with these women, they're our captives, but their husbands are here too. What do we do? And Allah's response is, what are you talking about? Well, of course you're not allowed to have sex with married women unless they're your battle captives. So do whatever you want with these women.
We find this a common theme within Islam, and Bill Warner talks about the dualism of Islam, where there are a set of rules for Allah, and then there's a set of rules for Muhammad. there's a set of rules for Muhammad, and then there's a set of rules for Muslims, and they're not the same. And then we have a set of rules for men, Muslim men, and we have a set of rules for Muslim women.
Set of rules for Muslims and unbelievers.
Exactly. This dualistic theme is so anathema to everything that we in the Christian faith were, we have the golden rule, do unto others as you would want to have. This is one of the simplest things that I find when I step back and look at it. It's so hard for me to understand why people don't sometimes see that. But I can also understand because there's just a natural rejection to criticize another person's religion. It's almost within our DNA in America to be able to not do this. And one of those ways that women are also oppressed is in how many witnesses it takes to have rape to be charged. And this dates back to, again, within the Hadiths, talking about his own wife. How tell us that story and what the Hadiths, what the Quran and what the Hadiths say about rape, and how a woman has to prove that. What are the justifications?
Well, one day Muhammad's army took off and didn't realize that they had left Aisha behind. And then, so later on, one of Muhammad's companions shows up with Aisha, right? Because he had found her. She had supposedly
His
wandered
child
off.
bride.
Yeah, and we don't know. Maybe she did commit adultery. Maybe she didn't. We don't know. We know that Aisha came back and claimed, "Hey, I wandered off looking for a bracelet that I lost, and this nice man took me back to camp." And so people are accusing her of committing adultery, and Muhammad doesn't know what to do. They don't know, is Aisha going to end up being stoned to death or something like that? But then Muhammad gets a revelation saying, if they're going to accuse Aisha of sexual indecency, why didn't they bring their 4 witnesses? And so, you didn't have 4 witnesses, and so there can be no charge against her. And you find this over and over again in the Muslim sources, where it's just some specific situation, there will be Muhammad's solution from Allah to that problem, and it ends up messing up everyone's future life. It ends up causing huge problems. Like Muhammad even having a relationship with Aisha in the first place. That was from Allah. He was given he had a dream from Allah where Allah gave Aisha to him as a gift. He had sex with her when she was 9 years old. And so here you have the Islamic justification. No, it was from Allah, and yet to this day in Saudi Arabia there's no minimum age for marriage, because, well, if you start saying there's 12 or 13 or 15 or something like that, so you're condemning Muhammad, and so you can't have something like a minimum age. And so something that Muhammad does ends up causing a lot of problems for people down through history. But with that situation with Aisha, oh my goodness, my favorite wife, my child bride, is accused of adultery. I got a revelation from Allah that fixes the problem.
Sure.
But the Islamic fix for the problem is that you can't accuse someone of sexual sin without 4 male witnesses. And so, and guess what? There's not 4 male witnesses who are willing to testify in most issues of adultery or rape.
For a woman to
or thing
bring
like
this
that.
forward without those witnesses, the consequences for her are...
Yeah, because
It's a catch-22.
Yeah, there are massive numbers of women in places like Pakistan who are in prison because they were raped. And because here's how it works, right? A girl gets raped, and she doesn't want to say anything because she's not going to have witnesses, so she keeps her mouth closed. Then she gets pregnant, but she gets pregnant from the rape. And so
There's evidence of infidelity.
Oh, what did you do here? That guy raped me. Well, where are your witnesses? I don't have any. Well, we know you did something.
Right.
We know you did something. We don't know that guy. You have no basis for accusing that other man. So the man goes free. She goes to prison, because this is a moderate ruling now. Now you have moderate prison sentences instead of just stoning her to death or lashing her. And so the prisons of Pakistan are filled with women and girls who've been there for being raped, because they can't defend themselves. They can't defend themselves in court. They can't present the charges against the man because of something that Muhammad used to rescue Aisha from accusations of adultery.
it never ceases to amaze me as I've watched you over the years, David, the information you provide on your YouTube channel. You can find Dr. David Wood, Christian apologist and Islamic expert, on his YouTube videos, which have had over 42 million views, or 600. There's a whole series, and he's in the middle of a series right now answering Islam. It's going to continue on. I think he's up to 14 right now. But you can go to YouTube, Google up Dr. David Wood, Acts 17 Apologetics Ministry. You'll find those videos. You've been listening to the Lance Hoppus Show here on KSLR 630 AM The Word and KLUP 930 The Answer. We hope you'll tune in next week. We hope you go forward this week with the information we've shared with you, and knowing that the Holy Spirit is working within your life if you become the vessel that He wants you to be. Don't push back. Be bold. Step out in faith. And know, just like as David has told his story tonight, you can have a story. You can have a difference in the people's lives that you come in touch with. And God can use you any way you will allow Him to do that. But you have to be willing to allow Him to come into your life. So we want you to come back next week. We hope you have a great week, San Antonio, and we want to just wish you nothing but God's blessing. So thanks so much for listening on the Lance Hoppus God Family and Country Show.